Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar, 5 Steps to Medical Device Commercialization in the U.S., presented by Medical Design and Outsourcing. Before we begin, I'd just like to cover a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of the audience console are multiple application widgets that you can use. We'll have a Q&A at the end of today's webinar. You can ask any question during the webcast using the Q&A widget, and we do capture all questions. A copy of today's slide deck is available in the resource list widget, and it looks like a green folder at the bottom of your screen. You can expand your slide area by clicking on the maximize icon on the top right of the slide area, or by dragging the bottom right corner of the slide area. And if you have any technical difficulties throughout the webcast, please use the help widget. It has a question mark icon and covers common technical issues. Just so you know, an on-demand version of this webcast will be available after one day after the webcast, and it can be accessed on Medical Design and Outsourcing's website or using the same audience link that we sent to you earlier. And I just wanted to remind you, if you are sharing on social media, you can use our Twitter hashtag MDO webinar. My name is Heather Thompson. I'm the senior editor of MDO. And today our featured speaker is Michael Lynch. He's the managing consultant with Intertech. Mike has more than 35 years of experience in the medical device space, focusing on R&D, product development, manufacturing, marketing. Mike, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Heather. It's my pleasure. I look forward to covering this topic with the audience. So today what I'm going to present is we call it 5 Steps to Medical Device Commercialization in the U.S. You might consider that slight oversimplification, but it really does boil down to those major steps with a lot of detail underneath each one, of course. So in order to get into the market, you have to consider the FDA, and today we're going to spend most of our time talking about that. But there are other regulatory agencies that govern your market entry in the U.S., depending on the type of device that you're trying to bring to market. That would include OSHA, the FCC, National Fire Prevention, National Electric Council, just to name a few. So an overview of the 5 steps from an FDA point of view is you're going to classify your device. You're going to choose the pre-market submission pathway. You're going to prepare that pre-market submission packet that's going to go to the FDA. You're going to submit it. And then once you get approval from the FDA, you're going to register both your facility and your device, and then you'll be ready to go to market. So as I said, it's a fairly simplified version of what takes place, but we're going to cover the process in detail over the next 30 minutes or so. So step 1, classifying your device. So a medical device is defined by law in the FD&C Act. Medical devices are categorized in the U.S. into one of 3 classes, and that's based on the risk that they present to either the patient or the user. These classes are Class 1, which is the lowest risk level, and an example of a Class 1 device is a manual toothbrush. Then you move up to Class 2, and these are moderate risk devices. And examples of a Class 2 device may be a male condom, or it could be a non-invasive blood pressure monitor. Class 3 is the highest risk class of device, and an example of a Class 3 device might be an implantable heart valve. Determining the product classification can be done in a number of ways. The FDA provides tools on their website to assist you in determining what classification you might fall into. There is a database that can be searched in a number of ways. It's not as easy as Google, but if you're careful with the words, you'll find devices of your type in there. You can also go in and actually get right into the Federal Register where they have a listing of the different classifications. So most medical devices can be classified by matching the description with a section of the Code of Federal Regulations, specifically Title 21 and Parts 862 through 892, where they basically describe the different types of medical devices. Over the years, the FDA has classified and described over 1,700 distinct types, and they've organized them in the Code of Federal Regulations into 16 specialty panels, such as cardiovascular or ear, nose, and throat, or orthopedic and other types. On the slide deck, there is a link that will get you to a guidance document on how to classify your device. So in terms of the different classes and regulatory controls, Class 1 devices are governed by general controls. And general controls are your basic provisions that were set out in the 1976 Medical Device Amendment legislation that provide the FDA with a means of regulating the devices to ensure that they're safe and effective. The general controls in the amendments apply to all medical devices. But in the case of a Class 1 device, it's really limited to those general controls. And general controls include provisions to ensure the adulteration or avoid adulteration of products, avoid misbranding. It controls device registration and listing, pre-market notification, and many other areas of the regulations. So a Class 1 device with general controls can exist with exemptions or without exemptions. And here, when we talk about exemptions, it may be exempt from pre-market notification. It may even be exempt from compliance with good manufacturing practices. Then we look at Class 2. Class 2 devices have to be in compliance with general controls, but because they're higher risk devices, you'll also see special controls applied. And those are guidance documents from the FDA or harmonized standards. There are some low-risk Class 2 devices that also have exemptions, and they may be exempt from the pre-market notification requirement, and in a few cases also exempt from the application of good manufacturing practices. And then in the case of Class 3 devices, general controls apply, but also the requirement for a pre-market approval. So as a note, most Class 1 devices and a few Class 2 devices are exempt from pre-market notification, which we call the 510K process. And, but those requirements, where there are exemptions, are subject to certain limitations. And that information is typically found once you identify a class of device on the FDA database. It will tell you whether or not that device is exempt from 510K pre-market notification or if it is exempt from good manufacturing practices. So there is guidance on classifying your device. So which class your device is assigned will determine, among other things, the type of submission that you apply or are required to use to gain clearance to market the device. If your device is Class 1 or Class 2 and it is not exempt, a 510K will be required for marketing the device in the U.S. All devices classified as exempt are subject to the limitations on the exemptions, and once again, these can be found for that specific type of device in the Code of Federal Regulations in the different parts. For Class 3 devices, a pre-market application or PMA will be required unless your device is a pre-amendments device, and that means it was on the market prior to 1976, or it's substantially equivalent to a pre-amendments device, and also that the FDA has not moved a pre-amendment device into requiring a PMA. In those cases, though, where what would be a Class 3 device has been determined to be a pre-amendment, you may be able to apply a 510K in order to get to market with that device. A little bit more guidance on classification. Your classification is going to depend on the intended use of the device and also based on the indications for use. An example would be a scalpel's intended use is to cut tissue. A subset of intended uses arise when a more specialized indication is added in the device's labeling, such as for making incisions in the cornea. Indications for use can be found in the device's labeling, but may also be conveyed orally during sale of the product. So in the case of a scalpel that's a general purpose scalpel, that may be a Class 1 device. However, a scalpel that's specifically for making incisions in the cornea may be a Class 2 device based on the higher risk of its indications. As I said, classification is risk-based. That is, the risk of the device as it is posed to the patient or the user is a major factor in what class is it assigned. Class 1 includes those devices with the lowest risk, and Class 3 includes the devices with those having the greatest risk. As I mentioned above, all classes of devices are subject to general controls, and the general controls are the baseline requirements from the Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act that apply to all three classes of device, 1, 2, and 3. So once you've figured out which class your device is going to fall into, then you choose the correct pre-market submission. You can select a submission type based on the regulation. The most common types of pre-market submissions include the 510K, called the pre-market notification, the PMA, which is a pre-market approval, a de novo, which is termed evaluation of automatic Class 3 designation, and HDE, which is the humanitarian device exemption. Let's talk about the 510K to get started. Some Class 1 and most Class 2 devices will require a 510K. In the 510K, the sponsor must demonstrate that the new device is substantially equivalent to a predicate device in terms of its intended use, the technology that's used in the device, and the performance of the device as demonstrated by testing. Some Class 1 and Class 2 devices are exempt from the 510K if they do not exceed the limitations that are stated in the Code of Federal Regulations for those classes of device. Now let's talk about the pre-market approval. Most Class 3 devices require a PMA. A PMA is the most stringent type of submission. Before the FDA approves the PMA, the sponsor must provide valid scientific evidence that demonstrates reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness for the device's intended use. When we talk about valid scientific evidence, in the case of a PMA Class 3 device, that's usually going to mean clinical evaluations run under controls with a protocol, and that data will all then be submitted to the FDA to demonstrate safety and effectiveness. A more recent process in order to get your product to market is the de novo process. And de novo provides a means for a new device where there is no valid predicate to be classified into Class 1 or Class 2 if it meets certain criteria. For more information on how to prepare and submit a de novo request, you can refer to the resources listed on the slide. So typically a device would automatically be Class 3 if there was no predicate. However, the manufacturer can petition the FDA with evidence of low risk and high benefit. If the FDA agrees, the device is then classified into a lower class, and the fee for the petition is really not significant or doesn't exist at all, but you will have to pay the fee for the 510K. But it's certainly worth the effort because there's a significant difference between the fees for a 510K and the fee for a PMA, as well as the regulatory requirements are significantly greater for the PMA. So if you have a device, you're unable to identify a predicate that's substantially equivalent, we recommend that you take advantage of the law as it's read in Section 513F2 and undertake a de novo classification. The last type that's used less often is a humanitarian device exemption. And HDE provides a regulatory path for Class 3 devices, and in some cases Class 2 devices, that are intended to benefit patients with rare diseases or conditions. In order for a device to be eligible for an HDE, the sponsor must obtain designation as a humanitarian use device through the FDA's Office of Orphan Product Development. It's really not a good path if you're looking to get to market quickly because there are typically limits on the quantities you can sell. However, in some cases, when it's in the public's best interest to have a product quickly, you can submit for an HDE so that you can enter the market and address a health issue, and then quickly follow up with a 510K or a PMA application, depending on which way the FDA points you. So the third step is to prepare the appropriate information for your pre-market submission to the FDA. And the content is going to vary significantly by the pre-market submission pathway. The FDA provides an enormous number of resources for you to be able to understand what needs to be included in your pre-market submission. They have what they call device advice, which is a web-based regulatory assistance tools. They also have CDRH Learn, which is a series of video-based teaching modules and webinars that cover a large variety of topics and different guidance policies. You also have a pre-submission program where you're actually able to arrange meetings with representatives of the FDA and discuss what should be included in your pre-market submission in order to meet the FDA's expectations and requirements. Typically, the information you're going to need to consider when preparing your pre-market submission includes design controls, non-clinical or preclinical testing, your clinical evidence, and the labeling that will accompany the device. Let's talk a few seconds about design controls. All Class 2 and Class 3 devices must be designed in accordance with the design controls under the Quality System Regulation, Title 21 CFR Part 820. Some Class 1 devices are exempted from design controls. There is a guidance document from the FDA. If you enter design control guidance for medical device manufacturers on the FDA website, their search engine will take you to that guidance document. Let's talk a little bit about non-clinical testing. So the types of information and testing that are going to be required to market your device are determined by the device classification, the mechanisms of operation, what are the technical characteristics of the product, and the labeling, and that covers your manuals, your warning labels, and any descriptions of intended use and indications for use. So you'll need to, with your non-clinical or preclinical testing, support all of those claims that you're making on the device. So another factor to consider is that non-clinical testing performed in support of a pre-market submission for a medical device is supposed to comply with good laboratory practices, which are also government regulations, Part 58, Title 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations. And it's very good for people to review these requirements because as a company that helps people put their 510Ks in, we see a lot of pushback from the FDA when the data and the reports that are supplied don't comply with GLPs, don't have good traceability on the materials, and that becomes a problem for the processing of the 510K and causes delays in getting the product to market. Clinical evidence is another area where PMAs, HDEs, some 510Ks, and many de novo submissions are going to require objective clinical evidence. Now, prior to initiating a clinical study, the study sponsor may need to obtain approval of an investigational device exemption by the FDA, and this is going to depend on the risk of the device. So what needs to happen is you and a institutional review board need to make a decision on whether a device is a significant risk device or a non-significant risk device. And there is guidance from the FDA on this. And in the event that the institutional review board may not agree with your assessment on the risk of the device, you can approach the FDA and they will give you a decision on whether or not they think it is a significant risk device. In the case where a device is significant risk, the sponsor needs to register with the FDA and file for that investigational device exemption. In the case of a non-significant risk device, they can conduct a clinical study by getting the approval of the Institutional Review Board. All clinical studies must comply with the IDE regulations and must comply with good clinical practices. And there are recent guidances from the FDA as well as ISO standards that are accepted worldwide on how to conduct good clinical studies. Once again, additional information is available on the FDA website, and if you see their device advice under investigational device exemption, you'll have plenty of reading material available to you. If you are a non-U.S. manufacturer and you want to use clinical data from your home country, it will require a discussion with the FDA. Regardless of where the clinical evaluation takes place, you do need a good clinical plan, protocols, and endpoints. Labeling. Labeling for your device must be written according to labeling regulations and included in your pre-market submission. There's additional information also available on the FDA website, and I recommend that people take the time to review this. There are series of guidance documents as well as regulations that govern what you can say, what you cannot say, how the labeling should be presented, and what entails labeling. So labeling is not just the label on the product, but also the instructions for use, as well as sales and advertising literature, and any information that you might present on a website. So the intended use, indications, contraindications, all of that must be considered when you look at device labeling. So you got your pre-market submission package all put together. You've got all of the information that the FDA is going to require. And now it's time to get that pre-market submission into the FDA. Once you have assembled the information, you're going to send that submission to the FDA, and you're going to interact with the FDA staff during their review. You will have to pay some user fees. There's a user fee associated with the submission of both the 510K and the PMA, and I'll cover that in a subsequent slide. You also need to format the materials as what they consider e-copy, and there are guidelines on the FDA website in how that needs to be handled. So they're looking for electronic submission in addition to any paper submission. When the FDA receives your submission, they'll perform an administrative filing review. And after they've performed that review, they'll tell you whether or not they're going to refuse to accept it if there are components or materials lacking such that they couldn't complete their substantive review. If they accept the application or the submission and agree to initiate the substantive review, you'll start to have interaction with the FDA, and they will communicate to you within different time frames. I'll also cover those in subsequent slides. This slide provides an overview of the 2016 fees, and just a quick comment that they do have two sets of requirements. One is for what they consider a standard business, and that would be any medical device manufacturer with sales in the U.S. over $100 million. And then you have a small business, and that would be a medical device manufacturer with sales under $100 million. And you can see there's a significant difference in the cost of a PMA, $260,000 versus $65,000. And the differences go all the way down to all sorts of different aspects of the PMA as well as 510K. There are annual registration fees, but that's fixed and doesn't differentiate between the size of the organization. So what are the typical review times once you make the submission? Well, for a traditional or modular PMA, you're looking at 140 days for the manufacturing section review and the site inspection. And that assumes one 30-day cycle to address deficiencies. Now, greater delay will take place if you do not address the deficiencies in a satisfactory or timely manner. So a quick note, a traditional PMA has all the information supplied at one time. The FDA also allows you to do what they call a modular PMA, where the manufacturer can provide information in agreed upon increments. As an example, the FDA could review the quality manufacturing system and manufacturing documentation while clinical trials are underway, and then when the clinical evaluation is complete, it can be submitted in a separate module. The fee is required at the start of a modular PMA, so the risk that you have is that if you fail your trials or anything and you had to withdraw, it could be the loss of that PMA fee. Going back into the typical review times, we'll talk a little bit about PMA supplements or changes to a PMA. Small changes can be handled in 30 or 135 days, and major changes will take a 180-day review and may require an additional site inspection. Here's what we're looking at 510K review times. A traditional 510K requires 90 days. Basically, the sequence goes, they receive your submission. By day 7, they send you an acknowledgement letter, or they send you a hold letter if there are any issues with the fee or the e-copy. By day 15, they'll conduct an acceptance review, and they will tell you whether or not they're going to move it forward for a substantive review or if it's placed on a refusal to accept hold. If they do accept it and it moves to substantive review, then by day 60 you're going to get some feedback. And a lot of times that feedback will be a request for additional information. That's going to allow you 30 days for an initial response, and they may allow up to 180 days if you can explain why you're unable to provide the requested material in the 30-day time frame. If you do not respond to them within the 180 days, basically the clock starts over and you actually have to pay the 510K submission fee again. So if you get the request for additional information from the FDA and you supply it within the 30 days, then by day 90 they're going to give you a decision. And if the decision isn't reached by day 100, the FDA will provide you a communication and let you know why. But because they haven't notified you that you are able to move the product to market, doesn't mean that by default you can move the product to market. So changes to an approved 510K device, a minor design change, you could use the special 510K approach, and that requires a 30-day review. Any changes in the intended use or the technology of the device may allow the use of an abbreviated 510K if there are guidance documents which are the special controls or consensus standards that are also considered the special controls for that type of device. Otherwise, a traditional 510K would be required for those changes, and you're into the same 90-day review for both. There was a recent new draft guidance issued on how to determine the appropriate pathway for the changes or whether the changes require a 510K, and I recommend all manufacturers and people in regulatory review that guidance document. So the last step, we assume that you've gotten approval from the FDA, and now you're going to complete your registration and get your device listed. So a device facility, whether it's the importer or the manufacturer, must register its establishment and list its devices with the FDA. If the device requires pre-market clearance or pre-market approval prior to marketing, the device firm must wait until it receives the FDA clearance or approval before registering and listing. Registration of a device establishment and assignment of a registration number or listing of a medical device does not in any way denote clearance or approval of the establishment or its products by the FDA. So in your advertising, you're not supposed to say that you're an FDA-approved manufacturer of such a device. In addition, if you have a registered device it doesn't mean that you can automatically bring other devices to market. You need to verify whether or not that other device or a new device or subsequent device requires a pre-market notification, either a 510K or a PMA or a de novo, before you bring that to market. There have been instances where people misunderstood the law and thought that once they were registered, they could bring as many products to market as they chose after they got that first 510K through, and that is not the case. You will be subject to FDA inspections. However, the FDA inspections are based on the following priority. A manufacturer that has a pending PMA approval is at the top of the list. A Class 3 device manufacturer that has never been inspected is right below the people that have a PMA in. Then a compliance follow-up or for-cause inspection is your next in priority. And a manufacturer of high-risk devices is the fourth in priority. Class 3 device manufacturers should expect the FDA to visit every 2 years. There are some programs to reduce FDA inspection workload, and these have been piloted over the past few years. So there is a voluntary audit program where you get audited to ISO 13485. There's also a single audit program, which in 2017-2018 will move from a pilot program into a full-fledged program. And in that case, you're audited by a certification body, and that single audit program basically gets you a pass for Brazil, the United States, Canada, Japan, and Australia. There are no additional fees for FDA inspections, but you do pay the annual fee for the site, and that really is intended to cover those inspection costs. So as I mentioned at the start, we talked about the FDA. However, there are other market entry requirements that you have to consider when you're looking at the product. There's OSHA and local regulations that govern the safety in a workplace, whether it's a hospital or medical office, and so there may be requirements associated with your product that OSHA has that may not be linked to patient safety that would be governed by the FDA. For your products that have radio and our communications, so if it's got Wi-Fi or other things, the FCC regulates those, and you have to be concerned with compliance there. And then, of course, you have fire codes and electrical safety codes for permanent installations and other types of things. So be aware that there are other regulations that may be required above and beyond the FDA.
Thank you so much, Mike. Sorry. We'll move into the question and answer portion. If you're ready for it, Mike.
Ready.
Just a note for all of our listeners. Thank you for submitting your questions. We do have a number of questions to get through. So if we don't get to yours, please note we will follow up via email. So let's get started. So Mike, let's start with this one. I'm upgrading my product software. Do I need to file a new 510K? That's a great question.
The most general answer is going to be yes. If I assume that your product is a medical device and it includes software that controls the operation of the device, and you're altering in any way the risk of the device or the intended use, then you should submit it. The guidance that I referenced earlier is a good place to look to determine whether or not your software change is going to require that submission of the 510K. It may be a simple enough change, let's say just in the graphical appearance of the user interface, such that no other factors are affected, and you may be able to do a letter to file. But once again, you have to do the assessment and look over not only the guidance on when to file a 510K for a change in device, but also the FDA's guidance on software validation and their expectations there.
Great. What's the difference between intended use and indications for use?
So the intended use is really what function does the product perform. As I made with the example of the scalpel, the intended use is to cut tissue. The indications for use take that intended use and describe the specific conditions under which the intended use is applied. In this example, indications for use for a given type of scalpel might be that it's indicated for the use on the eye. You also might have contraindications where maybe that product is contraindicated for the cutting of epidermis. So that would just be a simple example.
Perfect. So if my medical device includes a smartphone app, is the app also considered a medical device?
Once again, this is an area of flux with the FDA. However, it also depends on what your app does. So in the event, I'll give you an example. Let's say you have a medical device that is a dermatoscope where it images lesions on the skin. And if your app actually takes that image that's broadcast from the dermatoscope to your app and makes a diagnosis based on the morphology of a mole or something like that, then that app would definitely be a medical device. If, on the other hand, that app only becomes a storage location for the image from the dermatoscope, that app may not be a medical device. There is guidance from the FDA on how to classify or determine whether or not your app is a medical device based on its intended use.
Perfect. Can you explain the difference between software classification and device classification?
So, from an FDA point of view, if you're looking at a medical device or software as a medical device, the classification is not any different. You could have a Class 2 medical device that is just software, or you could have a Class 1 medical device that is just software. Now, the FDA also, in their guidance on software validation, talks about what they call level of concern. And they have Class A, Class B, and Class C level of concern, and that's based on the risk associated with the operation of the software in delivering its intended purpose.
Okay. If a device is classified as a Class 1 device exempt from 510K, how does this affect the PMA process? That's a little confusing, but can you go over the files and forms that need to be submitted to FDA?
Well, so if a device is Class 1 and it's 510K exempt, that means that you're able to place it on the market without a pre-market notification. Now, the expectation, if the device is also not GMP exempt, then you still need to have design controls and a quality management system that's compliant with the United States QSR regulations. However, you don't need to notify the FDA that or provide a pre-market notification in the 510K format. However, you will still need to register your facility or your site, and you'll also have to list your device.
Okay. If we have a medical device classified as Class 2A approved in Europe, can we speed up the FDA process?
You won't speed up the FDA process. However, if you already have a technical file that's compliant and it's a Class 2A device, you would be able to take a great deal of that technical file and leverage it to complete the FDA's 510K submission.
Okay. How will FDA communicate with the submitters? Do they mostly use email, phone calls, in your experience?
They'll use snail mail, they will use email, and they will use telephone calls. The formal notifications are typically handled both ways. Informal communications can be handled via telephone call. Also, face-to-face meetings are often encouraged with the FDA.
Great. Is there a situation that a Class 1 will not require clinical study?
Class 1 devices are your lowest risk devices, and it's basically, it assumes that there's a predicate device and it's also been classified in that class, which means it's low risk, and the assumption is that no clinical evidence is going to be required. Typically, even on a Class 2 device with a 510K, a clinical evaluation may not be required. You may just need to perform a comparison of performance and safety with the predicate device.
Okay. At what stage is 21 CFR-11 involved?
Okay, so that deals with data integrity for software and or if you have electronic documentation control systems. And so it really depends on whether you're talking about in your product development or within your product. Within your product, it will be applicable if you're handling any patient data or anything of that nature, and it really applies. You should have those requirements from that in your design input specification at the very start of development.
In the context of preclinical testing of a Class 3 device, can testing protocols be specifically designed to compare the device with equivalent FDA-approved devices to demonstrate substantial equivalency?
Well, so on a Class 3 device, you can use testing, comparative testing of an existing Class 3 device to demonstrate that you have equivalent performance and function. However, it's seldom that the FDA will accept that alone unless that device is extremely well characterized. And but that's a situation where you'd want to have a discussion with the FDA prior to your PMA submission to sit down and say, our strategy is this, do you agree?
If a new device incorporates already 510K cleared electric device, such as a circuit board, is the new device subject to IEC firmware regulations?
So if you're creating a new device with a new intended use, but it's using a subsystem that was previously approved for a different intended use, you will be required to submit a 510K for the new device, although the other component of your device may already be approved. Now, that approval may help the FDA understand that the risk is well controlled. In terms of firmware, the requirements for any medical electrical device going into the FDA is that you're compliant with IEC 60601-1 as well as -1-2. And those standards have requirements for control of the software that is in those, and it needs to be compliant with IEC 62304. So I hope that has answered the person's question.
Approximately what is the expected total cost and total time for a Class 2 product submission? Good luck with that question.
You know, the fees for the 510K, I would have to go back to the slide and show you. I don't remember what they are off the top of my head. But The other costs are mostly going to be incurred by the organization that is developing the product and will very much depend on what they have as far as internal resources or if they need to use consultants. But you should budget probably for your 510K submission as well as your site registration and everything, probably on the order of about $12,000.
Okay. Is there any requirement for a clinical site in the U.S.? Can any hospital be a clinical site?
You have to find a hospital or some other site where they have already set up an institutional review board to review and evaluate clinical trials. Many of your larger hospitals do have those boards.
Is a company obliged to have a quality management system certified according to 21 CFR 820.30 for products which are approved in Europe as Class 2B? Is this the same or similar as 13485?
So first thing is there is no certification to 21 CFR 820. ISO 13485 is a harmonized standard that can be certified to, and there are no significant conflicts between ISO 13485 and the United States Quality System Regulation. There are some additional requirements in 21 CFR 820 over and above what are in ISO 13485, and the same can be said that there are additional requirements for 13485 over the U.S. requirements. Typically, if you're certified to ISO 13485 in the EU, all you would need to do would be to identify the additional requirements for the U.S., modify your quality management system accordingly, verify that you've done that, and then you would be compliant. On a Class 2 device, you do not have to submit evidence of compliance to the FDA. It doesn't hurt, but what usually happens is the FDA schedules an audit, and that's when they review your quality management system.
If we wanted to use a user interface that was different than a previous iteration, I assume, can we use the predicate device UI and only test this, or do you have to do a new HFE test on the whole product?
So in your risk assessment, you're going to determine how important that human factors is to making the product safe and effective. If you've identified certain factors at the user interface as being critical in being able to deliver a safe and effective product, and then you want to change that user interface, you will need to repeat your summative testing. The FDA has great guidance on human factors. They just issued it last year, so it is recent and updated, and I recommend you review that. We have dealt with a number of people who have made minor changes, and when we've gone through and done our review of the risk analysis and also looked at what was changed, there was no way that we could prove without summative testing that the interface was as good as the old interface. So the difficulty with human factors is it is human, and it's difficult to be able to take a look at something and objectively say, yeah, this is the same. You really need the data from the empirical testing to do that.
Is there any relationship between FDA and MDD device classification? I have a conflict in which a device is FDA Class 2 but MDD Class 1.
They are not harmonized. You will find products in the EU that are Class 2 here in the United States. They may be Class 3 in the EU and vice versa. So they are not harmonized, and each case is a little different.
Is there a separate device listing cost for an already registered establishment outside of the 510K fees?
I don't believe so. If you're paying your annual site registration fee, then you just need to do the 510K submission cost.
Is there any requirement for a clinical site in the U.S.? Oh, we already asked that one. I'm sorry. Actually, we should wrap it up pretty quickly, but there are a couple of questions left. We'll try to get through those. Do certain cities or regions have quicker approval time for a 510K or PMA?
I don't have the statistics on that. Would have to dive into the FDA website very deeply to find that information. I apologize. And
then just this last one, are the electrical tests required at the NFPA and the NEC similar, or is it required at the UNE 60601? If a device has been tested and approved after the electrical test, does the product pass the NFPA also?
So generally, NFPA and NEC come into play when you have a permanent installation of a medical device. So your typical medical devices that have a removable power cord are going to be attached as a basically to a pre-certified plug that's already been tested by the facility. However, in some cases, you have a large installation, let's say an MRI system or some other system of that nature. That system may be tested and verified at the factory and approved to IEC 60601 at the factory. However, once it's installed, the installation now moves past the requirements of 60601 also into NEC and NFPA requirements. So that's usually where you see it, that the requirements go over and above when you have a permanent installation of a medical device.
Great. Thank you so much, Mike. That's all the time we have today. I want to give you, Mike Lynch, a warm thank you for this exceptional overview. And thank you all for attending. Have a great day.